Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Heretics Podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order and the Morris Winchevsky Center. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name is David Wall, and I am the community's cultural programmer, and I'll be your host today. For this, the 14th episode of our podcast, I had the honor of speaking to healer, author, visual artist, and activist Wendy Elisheva Somerson. Wendy, known to many as Wes, currently lives in Seattle. They maintain a somatic healing practice, working at what they refer to as the intersection of healing and activism. They create beautiful visual art in different media, including encaustic painting, which uses heated wax. They're a founding member of Jewish Voice for Peace Seattle and have recently completed a fascinating new book entitled An Anti-Zionist Path to Embodied Jewish Healing, due to be released in May of 2025. We reached Wes at their home in Seattle, and here's our conversation. Wendy Elisheva Somerson, thank you so much for agreeing to be on our podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I know that that's a complicated question. How are you today during 10 days into the Trump regime? But
yeah, it's brutal. It's quite brutal. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, there's a tendency. I'm Canadian, of course. I'm speaking to you from Toronto. You're in Seattle right now?
Yeah.
So there's a tendency for Canadians to be smug about our country, but it's no longer appropriate because we're about to have a right-wing ideologue be our prime minister. So,
oh wow,
anyway,
okay, yeah,
it's like a fungus creeping all over the world.
Yeah, it's scary.
Let's save that topic. So is it okay if I call you Wes for the next hour?
Yeah, absolutely.
I like Wes. And I thought it was because you're a huge fan of Wes Anderson, the film director, but then I realized, of course, it's just an acronym of your name.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a good one, Wes. Okay, so I just want to get out of the way some thoughts about your book. I just finished reading it. It's called An Anti-Zionist Path to Embodied Jewish Healing. And when is it going to hit the streets, as they say? When is it being released officially?
Yeah, May 13th, 2025.
Amazing. And it's published by North Atlantic Books.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just finished reading it, and it's amazing, and I found it really incredibly moving and insightful. And one of the great things about it is how it kind of does two things at once that not many books do, which is that it has cogent political analysis in very stressful times. And in fact, you cite Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, which is a wonderful book, very personal book for her. But and she incidentally has blurbed your book, loves your book. But that's a book typical to her stuff and other political writers, where there's all sorts of political analysis and even prescriptions for modes of political activism. But your book has all that, but also kind of hands-on therapy, hands-on work for the body to deal with this stress. So I just found it's this wonderful mix. Anyway, congratulations.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really sweet to hear.
Good. So if there's any conceit to this podcast, it's that we like to look at radical or transformative or different ways of expressing Jewishness. And so you're a perfect candidate. So I like to ask people about their origins. Can you talk about your Jewish upbringing? Was it religious? Was it Zionist?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. I grew up in Ohio, and I was the youngest of 6 kids, and we lived in a predominantly Christian suburb. So we stopped going to synagogue when I was probably about 5, and mostly because my family couldn't afford the fees because there were so many of us. And I did not have a religious upbringing at all. We kind of assimilated into the Christian culture around us. And yeah, so I think I realized I didn't realize that there was some Zionism infused into my family until I became an anti-Zionist
Mm.
and really had to look at some of the things I had learned in my family about the state of Israel. So it's an interesting thing because I had very little Jewish cultural identity or religious identity growing up, but I still somehow managed to get Zionism infused into me at a pretty young age.
And did that come from your parents? Did it come from
Yeah,
some
it
sort of...
came from my parents and I think my grandparents, and it came in the form of just some of the things I talk about in the book. Like I always heard that they want to push us into the sea
Mm, mhm.
and that Israel was surrounded by enemies. And it really sunk in this way where I kind of internalized some like I didn't have really any understanding of the history of the Israeli state or the history of Palestine, but it really sunk in somehow that I was supposed to feel a certain way about the state of Israel. And I didn't really think about it that much or examine it until, like I said, I started to have a community of Jews who encouraged me to look at it. And then I was like, oh, wow, I really had I think that's how strong Zionist kind of ideas are inside of Jewish community that got passed on to me even when I had very little cultural Jewish identity.
Right. I would argue perhaps that the Zionism is a stronger identifying signifier for, I would dare to say, even most Jews than
Yeah.
spirituality or religion.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
And how did you come to your radical politics? You said that when you became anti-Zionist. So when was that, and how did it happen?
Yeah. Well, I feel really fortunate because I had been really longing for Jewish community, and I found a bunch of queer Jews in Seattle in my 30s, and I got invited to a Shabbat dinner and like a kind of a series of Shabbat dinners where we broke bread together and talked about how we learned about Zionism.
Right.
And so this group, which was very informal, it was just discussion at first, sort of naturally, like many of us were like, oh, I really want to learn more. And so then we started a study group on the history of Zionism. And we read things like Avi Shlaim's The Iron Wall, which
Mm,
was really illuminating for me. And we read Rashid Khalidi. And
mm,
it really opened up my mind to understanding Zionism and anti-Zionism. And it was just a very beautiful way to do it because it really came out of ritual. It came out of us breaking bread together and forming relationships. And I was doing it in community, which I think is the key for me of why I was able to do it.
right.
And so even though it was like hard to read and to like face into this history and to realize some of the Zionist things that I had been told in my family, it was really powerful to be doing that with other Jews who were also struggling with what they had learned growing up. And so it was a powerful way to be able to turn and face what I needed to turn and face inside a group of like-minded people.
And did this group of like-minded people um, incorporate other struggles? In other words, was the anti-Zionism or critique of Zionism or analysis of Zionism part of a continuum with other, recognizing other struggles, other oppressions?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about it. It's like the reason I got invited to these Shabbat dinners is that I was already kind of part of a queer political community. And I
Mm-hmm.
think for many queer people, because we've had to, at some point in our lives, even though coming out is a complicated, idea, at some point we probably had some kind of coming out or some kind of having to challenge like gender norms and identity norms and sexuality norms that we kind of already had become politicized, at least in this one way. And then almost everyone in this group, we all knew each other because we had already been involved in anti-racist struggle.
Right.
And so in a way, this group was like, hey, people who are really interested in talking about anti-racism, what if we look at Zionism?
Yeah.
And then we were like, okay. And so that we kind of came through intersectionality and then really focused in on this thing that none of us were talking about.
Right. So there was a kind, which is so common, and obviously when we engage with liberal, soft, or even left-wing Zionists, that's the one thing that is not talked about, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, in terms of your therapeutic practice, when did that start in your life? Your interest in dealing with the body and dealing with uh, emotions and from a therapeutic point of view. And was that intertwined with left-wing politics, or were they separate developments?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, in some ways separate, and then they became intertwined. I just think for me, as someone who had a lot of violence in my childhood, that I had a lot of bodily symptoms, but I was in talk therapy talking about my, past and trying to learn from it. And I still had all these bodily symptoms. And my therapist and I both agreed, like, you really need to find some kind of body-based modality. But at that time, there just wasn't that much. And then when I heard about generative somatics, by then I had already been pretty deeply involved in politics. We had started a chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace in Seattle, and I was deeply involved in that. And when I heard about generative somatics, I was very excited because it brought together body-based healing and kind of offered the healing inside of a political analysis and inside of political movements.
Right.
And so at that time, I was both like, oh, like personally, I've been looking for this. And politically, I've been really longing for that as well, because I've wanted a way for Jews to really be able to process some of the unprocessed trauma from our history so that we really aren't as susceptible to some of the things that the Israeli state is proposing based on our historical trauma.
Which leads me to my next question, which is, can you, in a succinct way, or however you want to, define for me generative somatics as you see it and how it's manifested in your practice?
Sure. It's a body-based healing methodology. And the idea is that we hold all of our histories in our bodies and all of our trauma in our bodies. And that the trauma and the histories are often held as contractions, tightness, right? Or even numbness from places that have been tight for a very long time. And so what happens is if we just do something like talk therapy, generally speaking, like I said, they're still going to be living in our bodies, and that it's more effective to actually do body up healing instead of mind down. And when we do body up healing, we're really addressing the body first as this incredible, source of wisdom, and also a place where we can effectively work with some of the trauma, some of the contractions, by loosening them and allowing different stories to emerge in the loosening of the contractions.
Yeah, you even talk about, and it's a word that comes up a few times, a fair bit in your book, is blending. So you talk about blending with contractions. Can you describe that practice and what it does?
Yeah. So, for example, if you think about a contraction that many of us have, like we tighten our jaws, right? Many of us tighten our jaws to hold something in, right? To not show too much emotion, whatever it is. And I definitely do. So if you think about it, here's this contraction in your jaw. And if you're trying to just say to yourself, like I used to do, like, why am I doing that? Like, I wish I could stop doing that. You're coming at it from a kind of combative point of view, and then you're entering into a fight with your own body. And what will happen is if you come in with that, like, why am I doing that? Stop doing that. Just relax my jaw. Your jaw's just going to tighten even more. So instead, what we do in blending is we approach the contraction in a way that acknowledges that it is doing something for you. So in my case, if I'm like tightening my jaw, I'm really trying to hold down some of the emotions that feel really overwhelming, maybe so that other people can't see them, or maybe just so that I don't get so overwhelmed, right? With all that is happening in the world right now, I'm tightening my jaw all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a good reason for that, right? But also when we come in with that gentle approach of just saying like, yeah, my jaw, like saying to my jaw, you're working really hard. You're holding a lot for me. What happens, because the jaw contraction is being met on its own terms, it actually starts to soften and relax. And then more is possible. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it really works, because instead of saying like, stop doing that, what we're saying to the body is, I see why you're doing that. It makes sense that you're doing that. You're doing a good job holding so much. And that offers what we call blending to relax whatever that contraction is.
Wow, that's amazing. Almost like you're collaborating with the stress, with the problem, for want of a better term. It's like
Yeah, you're collaborating with what we would call kind of the safety shape, the shape that you took on as an adaptation to something difficult or traumatic.
So one thing that you talk about in relation to this is, and I absolutely love what I think is one of the central conceits of the book, is that there's a specifically Jewish, obviously specifically Jewish trauma, but also there are specifically Jewish elements to your practice. So, for example, you talk about kavanah. Can you talk about what that is and how you use it in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So kavanah means intention in Hebrew. And inside of my practice, we use it as a way to center around what we care about. So unlike some forms of talk therapy, we're not starting out with what your problem is or pathologizing anybody. We're really saying, can we start from the place of what we are longing for? And so inside of somatics, we start with longings, and then we start to examine where can we translate those longings into something like an intention or a commitment statement, which is what we call our kavanah statement. We translate that into, this is the kavanah, this is the intention for my healing, right? And so I might have different kinds of kavanahs or kavanot, as they are plural in Hebrew, for different times in my life. But we make a declaration of the healing and the change we want to see in ourselves and in the world. And then all the rest of the work that we're doing follows that.
It's interesting because you said, and I think this really gets to one of the essential aspects of your book. You said, in ourselves and the world. And I really do love how that collective trauma and individual trauma are, if not equal, they're both things that need to be examined in your world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the term you have, was it political? Oh, I can't find it. Let's put it this way. A political framework for healing. That's the term you use. And I'd say that there's a tendency in therapeutic discourses, certainly in any therapy I've been involved with, to de-emphasize or avoid engaging with politics or systematic trauma as opposed to individual trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that the interconnectedness of these things seems to inform a lot of what you do. Can you talk about this more? The idea of collective trauma, and especially with relation to Jewish trauma, and how it affects the way Jews act in the world.
Yeah. Well, Susan Raffo, who is a brilliant healer, often talks about how the systems of exploitation that are outside of us are also living inside of us. And so it's sort of like individual and collective trauma are never really separate or disconnected. And so if we focus on one without the other, we're really missing something. For Jews, most Jews have a history of trauma because of anti-Semitism, because of expulsions, because of the Nazi Holocaust. For many reasons, we hold this history of trauma. And what happens, the way that we hold trauma in our body, like I said, we hold it in these contractions. But what is meant to happen when we experience something traumatic, dangerous, terrifying, is we're meant to have a survival response. So we think of these as fight, flight, freeze, and appease. We're meant to go into a survival response. So maybe fight back against something that is happening to us. And when the danger or the threat has passed, we shake it off and we let it go and we move on. What happens in trauma is because we are not usually entirely successful in fending off that danger, we're not able to protect ourselves, or we're not able to protect our loved ones. And you can see this because of the history of violent anti-Semitism. That's true in many Jewish lineages, that we haven't been able to protect ourselves. What happens is that trauma gets frozen inside of us. And so when that trauma is frozen inside of us, when we encounter something that you would call like a trigger or an activation that reminds you of what happened in the past, then you go into your full kind of trauma response, right? So you might go into a fight response or a freeze response. What that means for Jewish people is that we are easy to manipulate in some ways, because we go into these survival responses when we are reminded of something from the past. And then the kind of sad part about all this is that the Israeli government and Zionist institutions are going to use that trauma, and do use that trauma, to try to send us into a fight response as the only response that we should be in all the time.
Right.
And they're constantly evoking past trauma in these terrible ways, right? Where they equate Palestinians with Nazis, right? And they say, in the midst of this like completely horrendous genocide against Palestinians, they keep saying that Jews are the people who are experiencing genocide. And so it evokes all this confusion in our bodies because we're being reminded of a past trauma that was never fully healed or resolved. And so that makes us easier to manipulate. And so one of the reasons that I wrote the book is that I want us to understand how we hold trauma in our bodies and why it gets activated so easily and what we can do about it.
So I want to explore that a little bit more because, maybe I don't have the deepest understanding of what you're talking about. But when I think about the trauma that I have as a Jewish person, it's almost like maybe I don't have self-knowledge, but I have not experienced very much anti-Semitism in my life. I'm in my 50s. Maybe there's been microaggressions, but I had, so the trauma is something that has been kind of superimposed on me by being told that there's Nazis waiting to genocide me in the bushes when I leave Hebrew school, as opposed to actual experience. And so this gets into something else, which is the notion of intergenerational trauma, which has come up, which is a scientific term as far as I know. And it's still something that I have difficulty understanding or even trusting. And I'll tell you why. And I'd like you to respond. And it's kind of obvious. It's like, so is it genetic? Is the trauma genetic, actually DNA genetic, or is it absorbed? Is it trauma that's our elders and ancestors because of the way we're parented? In other words, because I hear this term intergenerational trauma, I read this term being used by some of my peers to enter into an almost narcissistic space in which Jewish people have more and deeper trauma than anyone else, and therefore actions such as the actions of the state of Israel are beyond reproach. So is intergenerational trauma actually in my bones? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah, I know what you're asking. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what is or isn't in your bones, David, but I will say, I'm not as interested in the scientific evidence of it being epigenetic. I think there's lots of evidence that both trauma and resilience get passed on to us through epigenetics, but I'm not an expert in that. What I do think is that, like for many Jews, we hear stories, right, of what happened to many of our ancestors, and we feel that. And
Yeah.
that can be a form of intergenerational trauma. But I would, and I think I totally understand your kind of reluctance around it or hesitation around it, because it gets used as a form of Jewish exceptionalism.
Yeah, that's how
But
it's used. That's how it's used. Yeah.
yeah, that's how it's used. And so I think that all people, people who suffered trauma, um, have intergenerational trauma gets passed down to all people who've suffered trauma, which is most people, right? So I don't think there's anything unique about it, but I do think the history of violent anti-Semitism is something that we know about, have lived through, and our families have lived through. And of course it's going to affect us if whole swaths of our family tree have been cut off because of violent anti-Semitism. So to me, it's like, in some ways, I think like what you're getting at is something that I talk about in the book, which is just because Jewish historical trauma is leveraged towards the project of the State of Israel and supporting Zionism doesn't mean that we shouldn't have healing from whatever trauma people are holding in their bodies, including historical trauma.
Right.
Because then we're just kind of giving ourselves up, and we're giving people nowhere to go who struggle with whatever they're holding, even if it has been like manufactured for them. Maybe that, it's like what you're talking about, this kind of manufactured, like, oh, they're out to get you. That still probably affected you when you heard it, especially if you were a kid, right?
Absolutely.
And so you're still, so you're still holding that. And we don't want to leave people who feel like they're holding on to whatever sorts of Jewish trauma in their bodies nowhere to go. We want to actually offer them ways of healing, but ways of healing that orient towards, this is something that connects you to all other people who've experienced trauma, not in an exceptionalist way, but in a way of like, this is what makes you human, right? We're vulnerable as humans and we suffer, and this connects us, and this can actually be healing towards a politics of interconnection and solidarity instead of a politics of exceptionalism.
No, I get it. That's great. That's great. Yeah. You talk about, it's an interesting concept in your book. There's so many of them. You talk about these three things: safety, dignity, and connection, and how trauma separates these essential states of being. Am I getting that right? And so how do you define these three things, and why is it necessary that they be intertwined?
Well, there are three fundamental things that we all need. So if you think about it, dignity is just kind of like the fundamental way that our beings need respect. We all need respect, right? We respect everything that is alive, hopefully, right? That's what the goal is. And we are part of life, so we also deserve respect. And then connection, we are social animals. We are wired for connection to each other. And so we need to be able to feel like we are part of communities. We are connected to other people, animals, the planet, nature, the world, because these are all part of the connections that we were born into. We need to be able to feel connected. And then we need to feel safe, right? We need to feel like we can take care of ourselves and those we love, that we're not subject to violence. And, the thing is, we all humans need these three things. And often, trauma really sacrifices one or more of those things and pits them against each other. And so I talk about kind of in Jewish history that many times we sacrificed maybe our dignity for the sake of safety, right? That was, I think that's part of what the bargain of assimilation was about. Right. Yeah. And so that happens, I talk about, I think in my own personal history, growing up with a violent and abusive father, that I often had to sacrifice, often my dignity for the sake of safety or for the sake of connection. Right. So these happen on both like these kind of collective levels for a people, and then they can also happen individually. And the goal is that we want to bring these three things back together again.
Right. You talk about part of the book that really resonated with me, a lot of it did, but this was a particular part, was you talk about shame, uh, and specifically a kind of different types of Jewish shame, and how there's this contradictory shame that comes up that I really, really can relate to. So we wrestle with the shame as Jews facing colonialism and violence perpetrated in our name. So that makes me feel shame.
Mhm.
Um, there's also, I'm either too Jewish because I'm loud and obnoxious, or I'm not Jewish enough because I don't know the prayers, and like I'll find myself saying things like, "Oh, Peter Beinart's so great because not only is he a left wing." Well, he doesn't call himself anti-Zionist, but you know what I mean, a Jewish
Yeah.
person on our
Yeah.
side. But he's also an Orthodox Jew, who speaks fluent Hebrew. So, he's a more legitimate Jew than I am. I might not actually say that, but
Hmm.
I feel that way sometimes. So can you talk about that contradiction and how and a sort of how you help people through this kind of I guess mechanism of shame?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. Well, shame is really, it's really tricky and hard, and it causes havoc in our lives. And shame is really a protective mechanism that is trying to protect us from some really big feelings and emotions that oftentimes we feel kind of more on an unconscious level that we would not be able to survive. And
Mm,
so we talk about in generative somatics, we talk about the concept of a trampoline. And so if you think about some of the things that we may have like internalized, like what you were just talking about, like maybe I'm not Jewish enough, that would be like a thing that is bouncing around on top of the trampoline, right? You're bouncing around in nice ideas, like if only I knew Hebrew, then I would be Jewish enough. If only I knew the prayers, if only I was Orthodox. This is kind of these like thoughts and ideas that feel shameful that we bounce around and on top of the trampoline. And underneath the trampoline is usually something bigger, deeper, and harder to feel. And so, just like you and I were talking about blending earlier, the way that we work with shame is first we actually go in and affirm some of those stories, not because any of them are true, but because what needs to happen as kind of a first step with shame is that we want to have the shame story feel like someone understands it. So if you were in that kind of a shame, like I'm not Jewish enough, and I was like, oh, David, that's silly. Of course you're Jewish enough. What happens is the shame will just dig in even more. And you
yeah.
would think maybe, oh, you don't really understand or you don't really see me, you can't understand this. And instead, if I come in and I say, in a very neutral way, yeah, you're not Jewish enough as part of a practice of blending, not because I believe that to be true, but because I'm trying to affirm that shape and what that shape is doing for you, then we can start to get to what is underneath that, right? And some of these big feelings around terror or rage or fear of annihilation might be kind of under the trampoline. And what we're trying to do is get some of those to move through our bodies.
I want to talk about the last, now 16, 17 months or whatever it is, the genocide in Gaza, and just how we've been experiencing being activists.
Mm-hmm.
So, like
Mm-hmm.
for me, as the Gaza genocide progressed, um, I found myself almost, how do I put this, like desperately memorizing talking points in order to be ready when I encountered my fellow Jews who like are overwhelmingly Zionist or Israeli So what are some other strategies you had or have to ready yourself when you encounter, say, a Zionist who's going to be saying hateful things? But besides just having these ready-made phrases, basically, that I had memorized? Because I know that you do talk about that in the book, ways to engage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it's just very hard, and this, what Gaza has gone through and what we've witnessed is horrifying, and there's no getting around it, and I feel, and so many people feel so distraught
Mm.
and shocked and horrified. And, there's a reason for that because it's a genocide and we're not supposed to be able to witness it and be okay. And
Hmm.
so, even some of the things I talk about in the book, like I don't like what you talk about in terms of like facts or counter arguments. They don't work. You probably noticed that.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, they don't work. You just both get entrenched in this kind of back and forth. And even like you can know everything about the history of the Middle East and everything that's happened and every war, numbers, stats, they don't work. So in some ways, when I have the capacity, I don't want to pretend like I'm so great at this, but sometimes when I have the capacity and if I'm talking to someone I maybe otherwise respect, I will try to find where we might agree.
Mm.
Maybe we both care about the safety of Jewish people, and I'll try to meet them in that place first before trying to move anywhere else.
Mm.
And trying to feel for what is underneath what they're saying. And sometimes there is, it's like hard to say, is it this manufactured fear or is there real fear there?
Yeah.
But sometimes there's real fear in Jewish people around if you're maybe listening to the mainstream news, or, if you believe any of the lies of Zionism, maybe you are scared for your people. Maybe there's a lot of reasons to be scared. And so it's kind of like finding the emotions and the more human way of connecting before going anywhere else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really hard. It's really hard right now. I feel furious at every Zionist. I feel furious at every Zionist organization. It feels like literally disgusting. Like any support for the state of Israel feels
Hmm.
disgusting. So it's really hard for me too.
No, I mean, it is interesting. Just two things come to mind. So we're talking about the different kinds of Jewish fear. I totally understand Jewish fear, of course. But, my mother-in-law was living at Baycrest, which is an almost entirely Jewish, really famous retirement home in Toronto, in North Toronto.
Mhm.
And, I couldn't look at these people, many of whom are Holocaust survivors, and be hateful, because that's a
Totally.
different. Um, but when I encounter younger people, I mean, I'm not proud of this. I was backstage at some event, and a quite young person was explaining to me how they've become more and more right wing and think that there shouldn't be a ceasefire and all this. And I told them to F off and walked away. And I was not
Yeah.
proud of myself.
Yeah.
And I realized that it accomplished nothing. But then of course, so in terms of self-care, and I think I know how you're going to answer this, but are there times where it's okay not to engage, you just don't, just choose not to discuss, just avoid discussions, just, you know, stay silent, because that's obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I think it's okay. And I also think like we have to take care of ourselves, and sometimes arguments are futile, right? And they're not going to get us anywhere. And then I think when we can, I do also take very seriously this call to bring our people along. And so when we can, I do want to try to engage people who are movable, so
Yes.
maybe not the people all the way to the right, but the people somewhere in the middle who are still caring and are like concerned that Palestinians are dying, but maybe still have a Zionist bent in their thinking. That's kind of the middle place where I think it's worth engaging and trying to bring people along. And it's like, for me, it's also useful to think about how I had to be brought along, right? And I have some humility about the fact, like, I didn't grow up in an anti-Zionist family. I didn't suddenly, see what was going on, or I talk about in the book, read Edward Said, and suddenly I was an anti-Zionist. It actually took a community of people who helped me learn and feel supported to come into my politics.
No, you're
And
absolutely
so
right. Yeah.
I want us to be offering that. Not everyone, it's not all of us all the time, but in general, I want us to be offering those kind of like learning spaces and encouragement for people who are still caring humans, which is not everybody, but many people are still caring humans, for those people to have a place to unlearn the Zionism that they learned.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I certainly went through in my early 20s a process around Zionism. But it is on an organizational level, and I'll bring up the organization I work for called the United Jewish People's Order that's been around for a century. And um, we are constantly struggling with this because there's only so much energy. There's only so much capacity. And do
Yeah.
we spend that capacity? Do we spend that zets or whatever the word is on trying to reach out to Jewish communities? Which Jewish communities? Is it worth it? Is it just banging our head against the wall? And then if we don't, do we feel like we're just preaching to the converted and what are we doing? You know? So that is a constant kind of discussion for us. Another one, and I want to get at this, I think you are particularly well positioned to talk about this, which is because we are a secular organization and staunchly secular, less and less, but and I'll get to that. But we started and we came out of a Yiddishist, diasporic, for want of a better term, North American tradition of labor solidarity and really communist and socialist derived staunch secularism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I've had conversations on this podcast and other places with people who think that is no longer really a smart thing to do, or even, because the future of the Jewish left is in a spiritual space. That's what I'm being told. And you talk a lot about, and you sort of end the book in this beautiful way, talking about ritual. So what is... I would love to just sort of jam, as they say. If you were to come and talk to my organization, what kind of rituals could we engage in as secular Jews? Or do you see it like, for example, Ariel Angel, who I interviewed from Jewish Currents, said that no, there needs to be spirituality. There needs to be a space in your organization for spirituality. You're just going to lose people. So what kind of ritual can we engage in? Why do we need ritual? And can there be secular ritual?
Yeah, such rich questions. I mean, I'm going to go backwards. I think there can be secular ritual. For me, I guess, too, the kind of binary of like secular versus religious or spiritual doesn't seem true to me. And I think in some ways, like, that's because I feel like we all can have a relationship to something that is bigger than ourselves. It doesn't have to be, God, capital G, which isn't really, it depends how you define it. That isn't necessarily always what I relate to. But it's like, I don't know. I imagine so many people in your organization feel, there has to be, because they're part of the organization, this commitment to like solidarity and a collective. That's something bigger than you. That's spiritual in a way to me, or holy, or whatever word that you want to use. That is something, it's like a devotion to something bigger than yourself. That can be nature, it can be the way that we're all interconnected to the land and to plants and to animals. Like I think we've just gotten too rigid about what it means to be secular versus religious. And I think there are lots of good reasons for that because of the misuse of religion. So I understand that it comes from a very real place.
So,
Sorry. Go ahead.
So, Ariel was talking about text. Ariel was talking about we need to engage with Jewish text. Jewish, even if there's not a belief thing going on, there needs to be an understanding of, an engagement with, on a communal level, Jewish text, Hebrew, praying, all that stuff. So that's what.
Yeah. Due respect, I would never prescribe what anyone should do, honestly. And, I know we are a people of the book. We're also a people of the earth and of bodies and of spirit. So I kind of feel like I don't know. There are lots of secular rituals, and there are lots of like earth-based rituals that folks could engage in. And there are lots of ways to take Jewish ritual and widen it out to also be many Jewish rituals are, they're all based on an agricultural cycle. So they're connected to the seasons and the land and to the earth. That
Mm,
just isn't what we always emphasize.
hmm
And so for me, it's like, yeah, I think if people are interested in text, great. I love text too. And if people are interested in nature, do a land-based ritual, right? You don't
Right.
have to use the words God. It's just like we are. I mean, the thing is what you're describing of where you're coming from, you already are invested in something bigger than yourselves, right? You're trying to move people to the left. You're trying to build solidarity. These to me are like deeply I'm missing the language, but I would say these are deeply spiritual concepts. The fact that we care about each other, that we don't just care about like our families and our individual lives or the people in our closest inner circles. We care about the world. We care about something bigger than ourselves. That's something holy. And so I think we can broaden our thinking about what does it mean to engage in ritual. All it means to engage in ritual is to agree that there are things bigger than our individual selves, and like, can we move energy together? Can we be together in a way that honors that, or that honors life, or that honors nature, or honors our commitment to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I'm being slightly disingenuous because, of course, we get together and we all sing together in the community, and there's a beautiful
Yeah,
sense of community, and
yeah.
activism itself is like a collective ritual in a way, I guess. Um, and maybe you've sort of answered. I want to ask you one more question. I hope we'll open up some conversation. And I
Yeah.
think you've just sort of answered it, but maybe we can go a little further. Um, I would imagine I alluded to it earlier. I would imagine that a lot of people where you live uh, are feeling things in the body right now in a deep and even new way because the Trump regime seems to push the boundaries of cruelty further and further every single day.
Yeah.
Um, and as I said before, we in Canada were about to elect an openly right-wing cruel leader as
Mm.
well. Um, so how are you dealing with these things on a day-to-day basis? And do you have any kind of, for want of a better term, prescriptions for us
Mm.
as we kind of stare at this what's, I mean, possibly a very bleak future.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I I think that I don't know. To me, there's always the only antidote that I know of is to come together with other people and other beings. And
Mm.
so, I feel really grateful. I've been part of the Jewish Voice for Peace Seattle chapter and the national organization since it began, not since it began, since it became a national organization in
Right,
2006.
right.
And I'm so glad I have a local formation of people who have each other's backs. And so to me, it's like being connected to other people right now and organizing and knowing that we will fight back together is really what we have, you know?
Mm, mm,
And I think to like know that too, our ancestors have survived, right, times of fascism, and it's in some ways a scarier time because of where we are with the environment. Like, it's truly
yes.
a terrifying time. I don't think there's any getting around it, but I think we still need to keep fighting back and resisting with each other and feeling really connected to what we love, right? Really connected to each other, to the land.
Mm,
I just keep, I what am I doing? I'm spending a lot of time with friends and in nature and organizing. And I
yeah.
think we all have to find like what is our resilience in this time, because we really, really need it.
Do you do Shabbos?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's we in my family just we always talk about wanting to do it and turn off our phones on Friday uh, uh and that seems so sort of localized and tiny and whatever it is, but I look at even that as a small ritual, and you know, like I'm beginning to understand what I've been missing a little bit in terms of,
Hmm.
and I think I think it's probably pretty common. It has to do with that shame thing, but we, and meaning myself and people who are going through similar processes, we reject Jewishness, and certainly my parents rejected it. The religious aspect, many of the cultural aspects, the baggage of Israel and Zionism, and unfortunately, I think that there's a kind of part and parcel completist rejection, as opposed to picking and choosing and reveling in the what can bring joy and what can bring healing, which is what I see as a person who really has tapped into those things from a Jewish perspective, and maybe model for me and others a positive Jewishness, which is, I think, wonderful.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think, I think one of our tasks as anti-Zionist right now is to rebuild the Jewishness, right, that we want and that we need.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that is the way forward. It's like, right, what will happen after the end of Zionism? I am certain that Zionism will end.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever that is, it may not be in our lifetimes and it may be in our lifetimes, but whenever it ends, we want a robust Jewishness that can carry on, and a robust Jewishness now that gets us where we want to be. And we get to have a culture outside of it. And the Jewish religion and culture has been evolving for a long time, and that it is so much older than the state of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are all things I think about in terms of like, how do we build a Jewishness beyond Zionism?
And on that, it's a perfect place to end. I'd like to say thank you very much to you for talking to me today.
Oh, thanks, David. It's been a delight.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, Wendy Elisheva Somerson. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name's David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.